Afternoon. Good afternoon. That's better. Welcome to Lunch with Books. This would be the time when you would silence your cell phones if you're a polite person, and I appreciate it. Next Tuesday, the 16th, Rehabbing Our Bridges with Matthew Bunner. This is an engineer who worked on the projects to rehab the suspension bridge, which needs more rehabbing, and the Humpback Bridge in Elm Grove. And then on the 23rd, Jessica Whitehead will be here. Her book is called Driftwood. It's about Harlan Hubbard, an artist, writer, and sustainability pioneer. And I added a new program on October 2nd in partnership with the YWCA, excuse me, for Hispanic Heritage Month. Her name is Jackie Lozano. Look for that that's October 2nd. It's a Thursday special edition. We're dedicating our program today to two people, Kathy Rothert and Dr. Joe Laker, who passed a couple yesterday or the day before. And Dr. Laker was, of course, a fine presenter, and he did 15 programs for me over the years. So this program is dedicated to he and Kathy. Our presenter today is Dennis Patrick Halpin. He's an associate professor of history at Virginia Tech. His first book, Brotherhood of Liberty, Black Reconstruction and Its Legacies in Baltimore, 1865 to 1920, examines some of the nation's first civil rights activists from the end of the Civil War until 1920. He is currently working on a book that tells the long history of Navassa Island through the lives of the men who worked there in the late 19th century. You will hear about one of them today. Please welcome Dennis Patrick Halpin.
I think I'll go ahead and hold this. Everybody hear me okay? All right, is that better? Great. Thank you all so much for joining me today. Thank you as well to the staff of the Ohio County Public Library. Really excited to be here today. This is the first time that I've talked about any of this research, and really did not ever envision that I would be willing to do this talk, so this is really great, and thank you all so much for coming out to join me today. And I'll go ahead and get started. Jeff Davis had decided enough was enough. The 16-year-old African-American from Wheeling, West Virginia, began mining phosphates on remote, desolate Navassa Island in the summer of 1881. Somehow, some way, Davis resolved to escape this speck of Caribbean limestone located about 40 miles off the Haitian coast. So today I'm going to be doing a lot of research or a lot of newspaper presentation. A lot of the sources I'm going to be using are the two Wheeling newspapers, the Daily Intelligencer and the Daily Register. And here you see the first letter that Jeff Davis wrote home from Navassa Island. He ended up writing a series of letters, and I'll talk about them as we go further. But he wrote, "My dear grandmother, I seat myself to write you these few lines to let you know that I am well. But I won't be long if you don't do as this letter tells you to do." Davis laid out a nightmarish tale. "The white men beat me with clubs," he wrote, "and don't give me enough to eat and drink." The heat made Davis feel almost dead. "It is so hot here," he complained. "You can't wear any clothes or any cloth. For God's sake," Davis pleaded to Martha Morris, his grandmother, don't forget to say as this tells you." Davis instructed his grandmother to write the Navassa Phosphate Company located in Baltimore, Maryland. Now the problem was getting the letter off of Navassa. Mail ships, warships, commercial shippers regularly called at the islands, but the Navassa Phosphate Company tightly controlled all movement and information on their American appurtenance. There was no chance that officials would allow Davis's allegations to leave the islands. So Davis improvised. he furtively stuffed the letter into a barrel of phosphate. It was, to be certain, a Hail Mary, but Davis had few other options. All right, so I would hazard to guess that for many of us here today, and when I first came across this story, it was certainly the case for me, Davis' tale provokes a number of different questions. Who exactly was Jeff Davis, and how did he end up on Navassa? And while we're on the subject of Navassa, what exactly is an appurtenance, and how did Navassa become the U.S.'s first Caribbean possession? These are the questions that will frame my talk today. But first, I want to explain a little bit how I came to find Navassa, Davis, and then Wheeling. I've known about Navassa and Davis for approximately 15 years. I wrote about Navassa in my first book, A Brotherhood of Liberty, which documented some of the nation's first civil rights activists in Baltimore. And in 1889, these activists that I followed represented black laborers that were charged with murder in what has since become known as the Navassa Island riot or massacre. And here you see, this is a cover from the Washington Times. This was kind of typical of the reporting that newspapers did about Navassa, and I'll talk a little bit more as we go further in the talk about what this represented and where Davis fits into this story. So the activists that I follow represented these workers. What happened in 1889 is the most famous event in Navassa's history. Papers around the world covered both the violence and trials. And Davis, as he did on earlier occasions, spoke up. He told the world what he had experienced on the island 8 years previous. So I held on to Davis's story. To me, it was an incredible find. He was one of the few sources that gave a worker's perspective of what working on the island was like. But I thought Davis, like most of the men who worked on Navassa, would appear one time in the archives and then fall victim to the archive's silences about black lives. But Davis left us so much more. He left us a remarkable record of Navassa Island that would have been otherwise left unknown. So for the past 3 years, I've been writing a book about the human legacies of the little-known Guano Islands Act told through Navassa's history. In short, and this is the legislation that I'll be talking about a little bit today, in short, the Guano Islands Act allowed any U.S. citizen, either you or I, that happened to be out on a boat in the Caribbean, to claim an island that was both unclaimed and uninhabited, as long as it had guano or phosphatic reserves that people were using to create fertilizer at this time. And in 1857, shortly after that legislation is passed, a father and son duo, Edward O. and Edward K. Cooper from Baltimore, used the legislation to steal Navassa from Haiti. Haiti had long claimed the island, but the U.S. government ultimately ruled in the Coopers' favor. Navassa became, and is still classified to this day, as an appurtenance. Essentially, it's a national accessory. The U.S. doesn't claim the island permanently, but it claims any resources on the island, and it reserves the right to mine those resources off of the islands. And for the next 40 years, that's what the Navassa Phosphate Company did. They mined the phosphates off of Navassa Island using mostly young black men, mainly from the United States, but also from the wider Atlantic world, to mine phosphates under really horrific conditions, I should say. So, though Navassa is approximately 2 square miles with 0 population to this day, its history is epic. The United States and Haiti both clashed militarily and diplomatically over Navassa. Navassa has served as the setting of gripping stories of survival and violence, of disease and disaster, and of financial misdeeds. Navassa itself has surprising reach. And here you see Navassa. On most maps, it's not even marked. It's this tiny, tiny speck of an island that's off of the western Haitian coast, closer to Haiti, but also pretty close to Jamaica as well. So Navassa has surprising reach. The island's tentacles extended into places like Baltimore, into Wheeling, a small town that was actually named for the island in North Carolina, and also into the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Navassa has been at the center of not one, but two Supreme Court cases, and the island's tangled history demonstrates that though the Guano Islands Act was principally aimed at remote and often uninhabitable islands, its consequences frequently washed on shore. But what I really love about studying Navassa is that the people that worked it led really fascinating lives. So my book explores the lives of the father and son duo that claimed the island, the Coopers. It follows a Haitian soldier that was born in the United States and then moved to Haiti sometime in the early 1820s, and then Haiti sent him to try to stop the theft that was happening in the 1850s. I follow military officers that were out on patrol in the Caribbean that started to hear a lot of disturbing reports about what was taking place on the Navassa Islands. But I am, first and foremost, a historian of both labor and the Black past. And this makes me particularly excited about Jeff Davis. Davis became the strongest and most consistent critic of Navassa, as well as an advocate for his fellow workers. He became, in my estimation, the island's first historian. And the more I searched for Davis, the more fascinated I became. He felt like a character straight out of a Twain novel. And just as importantly for me, he was the rare case of a young, working-class African-American who left behind a paper trail for me to follow. So I hope that you'll find some interest in this story as well. And I'll start off with a little bit of a teaser. Early in my research, I discovered something important. Jeff Davis was not really Jeff Davis. That was a nom de art. So let's start there. The legends, and they're plural, the legends of Jeff Davis begins in Wheeling. The Jeff Davis that eventually went to Navassa was not born Jeff Davis, but rather he was born Frederick Davis on March 8th of 1865. He's the first of three boys born to Lewis and Virginia was sometimes known as Jenny. Okay, so we have a little bit of a family tree to keep track of some of the characters here. You've already met Martha, the grandmother, up at the top of the tree, and you see Frederick down at the lower left-hand side. He is the son of Lewis and Virginia Davis. John Morris is Virginia's brother, as well as Charlie Morris Jr., who is also a son of Martha and Charles Morris. And I'll keep referring to these people, and I'll keep coming back to this slide as well. Lewis worked as a laborer and as a whitewasher. Virginia and her mother, Martha, kept house in the multi-generational household that also included Virginia's father and Martha's husband, Charles Morris, who worked as a barber. The family grew up alongside Wheeling, a growing city that by 1880 had approximately 30,000 people in it. All right, I've only been to Wheeling twice. I'm trying to learn about Wheeling here. Both times I've came, the weather has been absolutely fantastic. Today is absolutely beautiful out, but perhaps this description of Wheeling might ring truer if you live here. A writer for the satirical magazine Puck explained that most of Wheeling was located on an island in the Ohio River. He wrote, "The island is a very pleasant place to live, except in the summer, when mosquitoes are ripe, and in the winter, when the weather is frightfully cold, and in the spring, when the Ohio River is considerably elevated, and in the autumn, when the water comes still higher." Wheeling was, he explained, the only town extant which has been the capital of two states and then lost both of those jobs. Jokes aside, though, Wheeling's proximity to oil and coal fueled its growth as a manufacturing hub connected first via the National Road and the Ohio River, and then eventually the railroad to the rest of the nation. And in Wheeling, Lewis, Frederick's father, so again, going back to our family tree here, Lewis, Frederick's father, along with Charlie Morris, the younger, Frederick's uncle, navigated this world and laid the groundwork for the younger Davis. Lewis and Charlie became what, in the parlance of the times, was termed as known men. In other words, they became notorious to the police and, thanks to the newspapers, the general public for their various escapades. So here I want to offer a little bit of a note of caution before I go on here. The vast majority of what I know about the Davis and Morris men, including Frederick, comes from newspaper accounts. And though, as we're going to see, not all of them detailed scrapes with the law, many of them did. And these stories are kind of tough to decipher. 19th century newspapers oftentimes presume the guilt of African Americans. And so while I'm fortunate that these men appear in the newspapers so frequently, I have to use these sources with the realization that while I'm relying here what I am relying on here is a prejudiced account of these men's lives. The newspaper stories are a version of Lewis Davis and Frederick Davis, and Charlie Morris, but they're probably versions that these men wouldn't necessarily have agreed with themselves. So I have to be careful here. I have to read the documents, both for what they say about these men's lives, but also for what they may unintentionally reveal about who these people are. But there's no doubt, Charlie and Lewis became fixtures at Wheeling's courts. The diminutive Charlie was particularly notorious. Reporters described him as, quote, having very lax ideas as to meum and tuum, or what his'n or what ain't. But though the editors were loath to admit it, they also knew something else. Charlie was, quote, keen as a fox. He has, quote, been under arrest so many times that he knows all the quirks and quiddities of the law, and he would put this knowledge to good use. Charlie's most serious scrape with the law was one that was also the most instructive for the Davis and Morris clan. As a youth, Charlie had been wrongfully accused of killing a young white boy to act. And see, what you have here is Charlie Morris Sr. writing to the Wheeling Daily Intelligencer in the wake of what happened to his son. Charlie Morris wrote, quote, "We are colored people, my son and myself, and we are poor people, and our good name, which we have always endeavored to maintain, is our only stock in trade." Morris told readers that his son was defending himself that day, and he was right. Charlie was eventually acquitted of the charge. And as terrifying as the affair must have been, there was also a lesson here for the Morris and Davis family. And that lesson was that there was power in the press. There was power in getting some kind of publicity to bring attention to what was going on. Charles, Charlie, Lewis, as well as Frederick and Martha Morris would then use newspapers to great effect in the years ahead. In Lewis's case, this included creating a stage name of sorts. He was no longer Lewis Davis. He starts to become Jeff Davis. And as Jeff, Lewis became a local legend. Lewis never publicly explained the name change, but he likely thought of it as a provocation. After all, and if you go back and look at newspapers at this time, and I've seen most of these stories now, you are going to find tons of stories about Jefferson Davis, the ex-Confederate president at this time. He still figures very prominently in the press. So it's easy to imagine that Lewis, as a young black man, delighting in the way that his new name instantly attracted attention, confounded expectations, and induced the occasional eye roll. Davis made Wheeling streets his stage, and the papers eagerly brought his productions to its readership. Davis blurred the boundaries between law and disorder. Frequently arrested, he also worked as an unofficial detective. And I'll give some examples here, and you see one of the stories of Jeff Davis as detective here. In the summer of 1875, a man by the name of Charles Trippett allegedly robbed a dry goods store in Burnsville, Pennsylvania. Davis learned that Trippett had fled to Wheeling where he was staying with a woman. Davis walked into the offices of a local justice, a justice who he had appeared before on numerous occasions as a defendant, and he brought out a warrant to arrest Triplett. So this justice, the justice's brother, and Davis worked out a plan. Davis walks up to the door where Triplett's staying. He raps on the door. Triplett comes out, and Davis arrests him. Initially, Triplett surrendered without much of a quarrel, but this was a ruse. Upon reaching the door, Triplett broke free and attempted to liberate Davis's sidearm. While the brothers Gillespie attempted in vain to subdue Triplett, Davis drew his gun, fired. He missed his intended mark. He ended up hitting the judge accidentally. It passed through the fleshy part of the judge's arm, the newspapers explained. But though his aim was not true, Davis's shot had the desired effect. The prisoner, the paper reported, seeing the blood from John, the justice that he accidentally shot, John's wounded wrist, thought that he himself had been shot and surrendered without further trouble. Davis, the paper reported, hoped to collect the $50 reward for his services. So Davis walked to the edge of tolerated behavior in the 19th century without ever bringing any real danger upon himself. And though papers invited its readers to laugh at Davis and his exploits, he also laughed back by exhibiting his wit, his intelligence, and his daring do. Lewis, just as much as the papers, shaped his own notoriety, his own version of Jeff Davis. And growing up, Frederick learned the lessons that were imparted by both his father and his uncle. And by 1875, Frederick Davis began to carve out his own notoriety. The papers delighted in telling the tales of, quote, the notorious son of Jeff Davis. Frederick inherited the guile and the daring of his uncle and father. He was adept at the dark arts of till-tapping and pickpocketing. He could handle himself in a fight. Though this really wasn't his preferred method, he liked to use his wits and intelligence rather than getting into actual physical fights. So this is the life of the Davis and Morris clan, but by the 1870s, tragedy struck the family. On December 29th of 1872, Jenny Davis, I should have put this slide up earlier, but this is the story of Jeff Davis as detective with that case that happened with the guy from Pennsylvania that fled to Wheeling. But I want to focus on what happens in the 1870s here now. So when we look at the 1870s, on December 29th of 1872, Jenny Davis, Frederick's mother, died at the age of 25. Frederick's uncle, Charlie, used one of his tried and true tricks while facing charges for disorderly conduct. He asked the judge for a continuance so he could secure a witness. Then he used his freedom to skip town. If he ever returned, it's not reported in the papers. He did so clandestinely. Then on June 13th, 1877, Lewis, Jeff's father, died of tuberculosis. Frederick's grandfather, Charles Morris, also passed around this time. It's not exactly clear when Charles Morris passed, but he no longer appears in the 1880 census, and his wife, Martha, Frederick's grandmother, appears as a widow. So sometime between 1877 and 1880, he passed away. Not long after Lewis died, young Fred decided to pay tribute to his father by giving Jeff Davis a second act. Fred starts to appear in the newspapers, not as Fred any longer, but as Jeff Davis himself. And he starts to exhibit a degree of panache that exceeded Lewis's own considerable theatricality. And I would love to sit here and give you a number of stories from Jeff Davis's career. I really only have time to give us one here, but this is one of my favorite stories from Davis. In August of 1878, Davis, quote, discomfited an officer and made his escape under ludicrous circumstances. A lady, according to the paper, had employed Davis to sprinkle the streets. He took to his job with aplomb. The Wheeling Register reported that, quote, Jeff handled the nozzle, distributing the water in a way that might have excited envy in a metropolitan fireman. Davis's acuity with the hose attracted a hopeful police officer, but in his moment of need, Davis's courage and ingenuity did not forsake him. He doused the officer with, quote, a blinding flood of water, leaving him, the paper noted, a sadder but cleaner man. Davis's audaciousness was complemented by his ability to escape even the hairiest predicaments. There were few places or situations that Davis could not escape. Davis broke out of Wheeling's jailhouse on numerous occasions. He excelled at eluding beat cops and foot races, or if the heat got really bad, he just hopped the rails and left Wheeling for a little bit before returning. Davis is such a compelling figure to me, reading all of these stories. It's easy to get lost in his escapades and forget that this is a young man. This is a young man between the ages of around 12 to 15 at this time. He had experienced a lot of change. He processed a great deal of trauma. He witnessed as his now single grandmother, his widowed grandmother, struggled to keep the family afloat as a single parent to both him, but also his two brothers, as well as her own disabled son, John. The papers, much like they did with Davis's father, played the younger Jeff Davis as a fool. But this was a young man that was coming to grips with his life and his responsibilities. He needed to help his grandmother, and the responsibility really begins to weigh on him. So, around 1880, Davis starts to walk the straight and narrow, mostly. He still appears in the papers at times for various petty crimes, but mostly walking the straight and narrow. He explained to a reporter that, quote, with a widowed grandmother and 3 orphan brothers to support, that he planned to run for a page position in West Virginia's House of Delegates. Newspapers portrayed Davis's candidacy as a stunt. They played it for laughs. Davis, however, was serious about what he was doing. He produced, according to the Wheeling Daily Intelligencer, a paper as long as the moral law, setting forth his abilities for and claims upon the position. To the delight of Wheeling's newspapermen, Davis lost his race. Davis had run headlong into one of the main problems facing young black men in the slavery's wake. Job prospects, particularly those that paid well, were few and far between. Davis nibbled at the political margins, but when he sought an actual seat at the table, the doors remained shut. Still, he tried. He operated a cigar and fruit stand. Like his father, he became an unofficial detective for the Wheeling police. By 16, the editor of the Intelligencer took stock of Jeff's complicated public life. They wrote, in part here, everyone knows Davis. He was proficient in the fast life of a street Arab and became at an early age as notorious a character as Wheeling possessed. But in later years, he was successively a boot black, newsboy, telegraph messenger, and Democratic stump speaker, besides figuring in the local criminal courts on numerous and memorable occasions. Davis, intentionally or not, seemed to be following in the steps of his own father here. Toward the end of Lewis Davis's life, Jeff's father, Lewis also was just as likely to appear in the newspapers as a detective as he was for his various arrests. So here we are now, in the spring of 1881, and Davis is doing what Davis does. He left Wheeling. He's moving around the Midwest on rails. He was what people called a tramp then. He would ride the rails for free to various locations throughout the United States. Somewhere on his travels, Davis met with a new job opportunity. The Navassa Phosphate Company at this time employed recruiters that targeted young working class African Americans like Davis with tales of a Caribbean paradise, of women and easy work. So by July, Davis went to Baltimore, where he met with a person that he described as a, quote, big foreigner, who provided him with a place to stay and with cash. Shortly thereafter, the man asked Davis if he would like to do a job for him on the Chesapeake Bay. Davis agreed to this, but when he reported to the ship, he starts to sense something's a little bit off about this opportunity. There was a uniformed man there that Davis took for a government official, and that guy informed Davis that he was actually in debt to the big foreigner that was his benefactor. It's unclear what Davis and the recruiter actually agreed upon here, but it is clear that Davis did not agree to go down to Navassa Islands. Davis likely knew nothing about Navassa. Prior to 1889, prior to the violence that made newspaper headlines throughout the world, most people really didn't know what Navassa was, where it was. People that worked in the Caribbean on boats certainly did, but that's about the extent of it. For Davis, the island must have been an imposing sight. It rose approximately 300 feet. And here is an example or a picture of the island. So as you can see, it has a mesa-like top to it. And so what's happening here is on the left-hand side of this drawing, that's where they're mining phosphates, and then they're taking the phosphates in 2-ton buckets and pushing them down a narrow gauge railroad down to the edge of the island, where it would then be loaded on smaller boats and brought out to waiting ships like the two that you see here. The ship that's to the further right is most likely the ship that Davis came to on the island. It's a boat called the Romance here. Navassa was no tropical paradise. The island had an abundance of phosphates, it had an abundance of brush, but no water and few sources of food. And the Navassa Phosphate Company ran the island like a convict labor camp, and they could because of the provisions of the Guano Islands Act. The legislation regarded Navassa not as an island, but rather as a ship, and it vested all authority in the captain, or in this case, the superintendent. With no oversight, again, very remote islands, Navassa's superintendents acted in a dictatorial manner. The company divided labor along racial lines. White men managed, they meted out punishments, they acted as an armed security force. The black men that came to the islands mined, carted, and transported phosphates to waiting ships. Davis, like all of the other men that worked the island, signed 15-month contracts. They worked 6 days a week from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. under imposed silence. The company, due to Navassa's remoteness, but also management's miserliness, fed workers a diet of hardtack, salted, or according to many workers, rotting meat, and cheap coffee. The company also cheated its workers out of pay by luring them into debt. Many laborers complained that once they got back to the United States, they actually owed the company money rather than the other way around. The resulting conditions that the workers faced on Navassa were evident on the men's body. Each night, the men straggled into the barracks. And so the barracks are the houses on the right-hand lower side of the island. So the men straggled into the barracks, clad in rags. Some or all of them may have been naked. They were hot, they were sore, they were exhausted, covered in dirt and also phosphatic dust from their mining activities. Davis contended that, quote, "It was never winter here, so I'm almost dead with the heat." Beneath the filth, the men's skin was dark, a testament to the unrelenting sun and long hours of work. Davis, who the papers often identified as being mixed race, claimed that he was, quote, "black as the devil." Because they had to buy soap, buckets, and towels at a company store that charged really exorbitant prices, many of the men just simply decided to do without while they were on the islands. So Davis is here. He knows he has to escape. And incredibly, that story that I opened with him sticking the letter in the phosphate barrel, it worked for the most part. The envelope landed in the hands of an Iowan farmer who found it and then forwarded on to Wheeling and to Davis's grandmother, Martha Morris. Morris read the letter, and she was alarmed. She does what her grandson instructed. Say that I runned away from home and I'm only 16, Davis implored her. Say that I shipped here without you knowing it. Not taking any chances, Morris sent 2 letters to Davis's employers. Within a matter of days, she received a response. Morris surely read it with dread. On examination of our records, the letter explained, we find that your grandson, Jefferson Davis, contracted with this company for 15 months' service on the island of Navassa. The company claimed that Davis represented himself as an adult, and they fully intended to enforce the contract. Now, anger mixed with dread. Morris, however, knew that she was not out of options. For 10 years, this is a woman that had witnessed time and again that when it came to the Davis and Morris men, Wheeling's newspapers were like a moth to a flame. They were perpetually hungry for a new Jeff Davis story, and she was right. On the morning of November 15th of 1881, readers in Wheeling read the first public account of Navassa written by a black worker. Morris and Jeff became the earliest reporters of the Navassa Phosphate Company's misdeeds, and Jeff Davis was only getting started. Davis was not the only worker that began to push back against the company at this time. The men who worked the island had made their displeasure known really since its earliest days of operation. Workers protested. In one case, they revolted. They sent letters to government officials. We'll probably never know the true extent of the violence that occurred on this island, but some sources indicate that thousands of workers were unceremoniously buried on Navassa over the years. This much is certain. Workers had endured beatings with clubs, with brass knuckles, and the notorious practice of tricing, which had alerted the U.S. government to no avail. Tricing, real quickly, was a form of torture. So what they were doing is they were tying people either by their wrist or by their thumbs and then leaving them with their feet barely touching the ground for hours at a time in this really hot, horrific jail cell. It was a common maritime punishment at the time. So by the 1880s, the violence on the island had only seemed to escalate, but this time workers began to seek out the courts. On the same day that Wheeling newspapers published a letter by Jeff Davis, the Baltimore Sun reported on a separate lawsuit that was brought by one of Davis's coworkers, a man by the name of John N. Bryan. And here you see the story that was reported in the Baltimore Sun. Bryan claimed that William Shea, one of the bosses on the island, attacked him twice, once with a hoe and again with the butt of a revolver. When Bryant sought redress, the superintendent subjected him to further violence. Bryan and his witnesses also detailed other acts of violence and complained of being ill-fed. A white witness, a man by the name of William Henry McCardle, saw men whipped on the island and was instructed, if the hands did not do right, to club them. So Davis is desperate to leave Navassa at this point. The past few months had been hellacious. Davis wrote in another letter home that, quote, 3 men died since I had been here with the yellow fever. Yellow fever was fairly common on the island. I feel sick, so goodbye. His first efforts at escape thwarted, Davis decided he needed a plan B. And if Davis knew one thing, he knew this. There was no place in Wheeling that could hold him. What would make Navassa any difference? He plotted. He drew on his years of experience. Davis sweet-talked the captain of an English vessel. The captain told him if he could escape, he would promise to take him back to the United States. And in an opportune moment, Davis slipped out of the barracks. So we have a close-up, the barracks there in the right foreground. Davis slips out of the barracks. He goes, it's not clear, he might have jumped off the island's coast, or he might have gone to the crane that lowered phosphates and menin off the island. However, he gets down to the island, or he gets off of the island into the waters. And he swims harder than he had ever swam in his life. He pushed his endurance to the limit. Company officials had been alerted about his escape, and they're standing on the shore and they're shooting at him. The short swim felt like an eternity. But when Davis reached the boat, the captain's word proved true. He hurried Davis aboard, he hid him beneath a hogshead, and company officials searched in vain for him. But Davis was nowhere to be found. The skills that Davis had honed on wheeling streets had paid off. Impossible is too strong of a word to describe what Davis accomplished, but he definitely had beaten the odds. His escape is the only successful escape from Navassa that I have found in all of the things that I have read about Navassa's history. Within months, the Wheeling Register's editors wrote, with both trepidation and excitement, Jeff Davis, the irrepressible moke who has been out of the city for a couple of years, telegraphs from Baltimore that he will be home on the first train. Davis, however, was not done with Navassa. He and his co-workers intensified their campaign for justice. In August of 1882, two workers smuggled anonymous accounts of their treatment into the hands of Department of State officials. One told of numerous men being beaten by company guards. The other alleged that Navassa's doctor was poisoning workers. In yet another case, a man by the name of Victor Charles, who had been working on the island, charged William Shea, the same guard that John Bryan had charged earlier, with assaulting and beating him. Then in December, Davis received, quote, several letters from friends on the island, giving graphic accounts of a bloody affair which has torn up the meager population of Navassa. Davis knew what to do. His next stop was the intelligencer's office. So these are some of the documents I found. The one on the left is a document from the National Archives. We have the story from the Baltimore Sun about William Shea, and then on the bottom right is the story that features Jeff Davis in Wheeling. So I was floored when I found this article. When I started researching Navassa, especially for the years before 1889, I had located a couple of scraps. I knew at this time that a worker on the island had filed a lawsuit against one of the guards there named William Burgess. But the Baltimore papers really sensationalized affairs. They focused on an alleged conspiracy for workers to murder all of the white men on the island, blow up the magazine, set fire to the building, and then escape in boats. Davis provided some different answers, and he countered the poor and prejudiced coverage in the Sun. According to Davis, the trouble here began over a woman named Nellie Grant. The claim was curious. The company had actually prohibited women from being on Navassa. But in this case, a worker by the name of William Christian got in an argument with a guard named Mr. Mack. The guard was James Mahon, whose cruelty later gained wider exposure during the 1889 trials. Mack attempted to arrest Christian, and of all of the places on the island, workers most feared Navassa's jails. A reporter for the New York Times described it as, quote, a whitewashed wooden house of one room, having one small grated window that stands on a pile of rocks, wholly unprotected from the sun. The company charged the men for each day of their imprisonment, a key way that they indebted workers, and they often tortured them while in custody. For 4 days, Christian lived on the lam, but with no water, he could only hold out for so long. On the 4th night, Davis reported, Christian returned to the barracks, but guards had spotted him. Burgess went to arrest the man, and the two men fought. But Christian got the better of Burgess, heaving him out of a window into a rock mine. Hurt and angry, Burgess unholstered his gun, re-entered the barracks, and began firing promiscuously, killing one worker and injuring 3 others. So I'm going to skip a little bit ahead because I want to make sure that we have time for questions here, but I'll wrap up with saying one of the things here is that Navassa really left a mark on Davis. He continued to fight on behalf of the men that were exploited on the island, doggedly pursuing his wages and testifying against the company. Davis seemingly never stopped talking about the place. The papers talked about him sarcastically pining for Navassa during a wheeling winter. The newspapers periodically described him as Jeff Davis of Navassa, or as that Navassan terror, Jeff Davis. Even years later, in 1887, the Wheeling press still marveled at Davis's escape. But Davis could not stop talking about the island because he still sought justice. In 1886, he traveled to Washington to lobby for a consulship to the island of Navassa. The Intelligencer's editors, quote, hope that Davis will get the office or some other one away from here and stay there. The next year, Davis told friends that he was traveling again to Baltimore to try to recoup his wages. Davis spoke about Navassa publicly for the last time in September 1889. A reporter for the Cincinnati Commercial Tribune had tracked Davis down to learn about Navassa. The island was a hot topic at the time. Davis, like much of the rest of the world, had read of the recent violence. It was the stuff of late 19th century nightmares. According to reports, the island's population of approximately 140 workers. So, and here you see some of the headlines that produced. The island's population of approximately 140 workers turned the world upside down, overpowering the 11 white officers on the island, killing 5 in the process. But prior to Davis, most people understood the island and what happened there because of these headlines. What Davis offered was something different. According to Davis, Navassa was indeed a place of violence, but it was a place of violence not because of the black workers. He didn't know what happened in 1889, but he knew that if workers had experienced what he had, then what happened here was no mystery. Davis told his story of greed, abuse, and survival, and within months, the workers on Navassa in 1889 would echo many of these same stories. So when Jeff Davis blew the lid off Navassa, he opened a world that had previously existed only in the shadows. Davis is a rare witness. Most of the thousands of men who worked the island left behind only their name, most not even that. And though some workers had complained about their treatment before, their complaints almost never reached the public. When they sued, they hit legal dead ends. Davis, however, was tenacious. He knew that his stories would gain traction, especially in the Wheeling press. And his stories remain one of the few moments where the cruelty of the Navassa Phosphate Company's officials became public before the violence of 1889. In this sense, Davis became one of the island's first historians. So I am going to stop there. Thank you all so much for listening to me, and I'm really excited to hear whatever questions that you have about Davis or about the island or anything else that I can provide answers for. Thank you.
If you have questions, raise your hand and I will come around with the microphone.
Hi there. So they wanted the island just for the resources, or is the military kind of playing a role also?
Yeah, so the question is whether the United States just wanted the island for the resources or if the military had any involvement. And the answer is yes to both of those, kind of. So between 1857 and 1898, the company controlled the island. They're mining phosphates off it, but because of the Spanish-American-Cuban War that breaks out, they were no longer able to do that. So the company abandons the island at that point. The United States doesn't give up the islands, and as the construction of the Panama Canal is nearing completion, they actually see the island as a benefit because they wanted to, and they did, they erected a lighthouse on the island to help pilot ships eventually to the Panama Canal. So it ends up, the lighthouse on the island remains in operation until the 1930s. And then after that, it's really now a place that ornithologists, bird watchers, professional bird watchers, go to study birds. And a few other uses like ham radio operators broadcast from the island occasionally. But yeah, that's kind of the status of the island right now.
So U.S. doesn't own it then?
It does, yeah.
Oh,
It still claims ownership to it, and
ownership.
Haiti still
Okay.
disputes ownership of it. So every once in a while, Haitian officials work to try to reclaim the island.
So how did they exactly get it from Haiti? Oh, sorry. How did they exactly get it?
The island. So
Yeah.
the men that own the Navassa Phosphate Company went there. There was nobody on it. They landed. They left workers,
there was nobody there.
they claimed it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
the Haitian military sent gunboats in 1857, but the United States sent its own down and kind of ran them off. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for the questions.
Hey, thanks. So my understanding is that actually Haiti did have people there and they were using it. And that it was just the United States going in and just saying, as part of their imperialism, an idea that they wanted to take different pieces of land.
Yes.
That's what they did.
That is correct. So Haitian fishermen had been using the island for a long time. Haiti had long claimed it. It was ceded to Haiti in some of the treaties that they had with France following Haiti's revolution. But yeah, the United States, so there's other instances where other U.S. citizens go to different islands and the U.S. goes there, a couple of businessmen from the United States go there, they try to claim the island, but when they do, the Spanish
Okay, so to this day, though, it's not technically a U.S. territory, which is why I understood that there were some questions about who would decide the fate of the people that were in the riots.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't technically under U.S. jurisdiction, but the people were from there, so...
Yeah, so just a little bit of a corrective there. So the U.S. claims it as an impertinence, so they claim it essentially as an accessory. It's not technically a U.S. possession in the same way that, say, like Puerto Rico is today. So they're treating the island as a ship here. And when the violence happens in 1889, there are questions like you alluded to, like where are we going to try this case? There's no courts on Navassa. What do we do? And because the company was based in Baltimore, the Baltimore prosecutor at the time, and you can go back into like the National Archives and kind of follow the paper trail, he is really worried that the worker is going to make it to New York City and that the trial will be held in New York City. So he's like 4 days before the boats get back to Baltimore, he goes out on a boat into the Chesapeake Bay to look for the boats coming in so he can direct them into Baltimore. And he's successful, and the cases end up being held in Baltimore's circuit courts.
Okay, one more question. So bad.
Yes.
And so, I mean, they were literally just taking the excrement from the birds and the bats.
Absolutely. Yes.
And so the health issues from that alone, I mean, would seem to be killer.
Yeah, they're inhaling it, right? Not surprisingly, some of the workers that I've been able to follow don't live very long lives. Many of them pass away within a couple of months of getting back to the island. That could be because of some of the things you alluded to. It could have been because of the really horrific work that they were doing. But so... Yes, the guano smells terrible. And what they were doing, though, is so when they would come back, when they would take workers back from Navassa to Baltimore, they would actually make the workers ride with the guano underneath. It's just horrific, yeah. It's hard to imagine how brutal and how unhealthy and how deadly this place really was.
And so, sorry, I lied. One more question.
Yeah.
So I know that it's used as fertilizer.
Yes.
And that's what it was used for then, but I understand there's been a resurgence of people searching to use guano as fertilizer because it's more eco-friendly and...
Oh, interesting. Yeah, because they figure out a way to synthetically essentially produce the same effects that guano provided for agriculture. So by the 20th century, most of the guano islands are not really in use anymore because they figured out how to synthetically do it. But that's really interesting that that some people have started to turn back to it. Hopefully, the mining will not be done in the same way that it was done in the 19th century.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for the questions.
Hello. How long did it take you to gather all your information, and how long did it then take you, sorry, to write your book?
Yeah, so the question is, how long did it take me to find this information? So I've known about the case. I found out about the violence in 1889 very, very early in the research of my first book. So this would have put me like around 2009 or so when I first found it. But the book that I wrote wasn't specifically about the island. So I found some information about it, and was interested in doing more, but at the time kind of just walked away from it. I picked up the research about 3 or 4 years ago, and I had done research. As more and more things get digitized now, like when I first started doing research, you had to go look at microfilm newspapers all the time. It take forever to find these things. And because this island was reported in such a scattershot manner, I can't imagine doing that. Now I can just put the word into a search engine and I can get a number of hits. But even still, up to about 3 years ago, I had researched it and wrote an article about the island. And I had found some additional information about some of the workers, not yet Jeff Davis. I thought at the time, this is it, I'm done. I had found more than I'd ever find about these men. They had really common names: Henry Jones, Jeff Davis, Ed Smith. And I thought, there's no way I'm going to be able to find out anything about these men. That changed for me when I went to the National Archives in December of 23. I went to the archives because one of the men that I followed, another man named Henry Jones, who was from Baltimore, was one of the men that had been convicted of murder and had served his sentence, his life sentence, in various penitentiaries. I knew that he was sentenced to Brooklyn, but his paper trail really went cold for me in 1899. A number of activists had tried to get him exonerated. So I was doing search, every once in a while as new newspapers came online, I would plug in his name and just to see if I could find anything. And I found an article in 1908, and I'm like, that's really weird. Most people weren't talking about Navassa anymore. It had been abandoned for about 9 years. And the article had one line in there that said that he got transferred to Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. So I look on the National Archives site, and the National Archives maintained prisoner files. And sure enough, there he was, number 27. He got transferred in 1902. And because he had tried to exonerate himself over the years, I found out that he was communicating with somebody that was described as a pardon attorney. Now, a pardon attorney could be a person, but it's also an office of the government. And that office saved all of the files related to him. So I ended up finding about 300 pages related to his case. It had letters from him. It had letters from his mother. And at that point, things started to snowball, and I figured out, like, okay, I can find this stuff. It's going to be a matter of, in some cases, doing needle in a haystack work, but in other cases, because of digitization, it's made it a lot easier. As far as how long it's going to take to write the book, I hope not terribly long. I've been writing. I've written a number of chapters, but I would guess probably a couple of years from now before it's ready to be published. Yeah, thank you.
I just wondered what ultimately happened to our hero, Jefferson Davis.
Yeah, thank you. So the question is, what ultimately happened to Jeff Davis? He lived throughout his life in Wheeling. He still shows up in the newspapers throughout the 1880s, throughout the 1890s. He ran and was the only president and only member, as far as I know, of a group that he called the National Tramps Association. He had an office down down on Market Street, and so he kind of was doing a lot of the same things that he had been doing in his earlier life, riding the railroads, get arrested occasionally. In 1894, he was in Indiana, and he tried to jump on a moving train and did not make it and got ran over and killed. And so the Wheeling newspapers reported this because one of his friends had been with him and told the paper about it. And yeah, that was the end of his story. That's a good question. So the question was whether he was buried in Wheeling. I'm not sure. I haven't looked a lot at the end of his life. He didn't really talk about Navassa in the 1890s, but I would like to go back and figure out ultimately what happened with him. Yeah. Sure.
Were most of the workers black?
Yes, almost exclusively, although, so in the early years, so in around like 1864, they did try using white workers. And then after the violence of 1889, they actually tried to use immigrant workers, a lot of Austrians, but the Austrians also complained about the situation there. And so I found some letters in the National Archive from Austrian nationals complaining to their foreign embassy about their treatment there, and then the foreign embassy contacted the U.S. government to find out what was happening. But other than those two circumstances, it seems to be black workers throughout the entire life of the company. Yeah, thank you.
I think that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you so much for a nice presentation.